Dear 10th standard students and parents, I am Kiran and I am an educator. CBSE board exam dates are just announced. I have made a few tutorial videos covering each and every concept in the NCERT textbook through question and answer format. The question and answer format will help you to fetch all the points that should be included in your answer. Basically, it will help you to cover the whole textbook in a short span of time. A word of caution though, what I am doing is giving you just an extra support. However, your primary source of learning should be from your teacher at school and the NCERT textbook. Now we'll start with chapter 1, unit 3, the age of revolution. So in this particular chapter, in this unit, we will be covering from page number 13 to 18 of NCERT textbook. And this topic is divided into 11 questions. And through these 11 questions and their answers, we'll cover the whole chapter. Okay. Now we'll start with the unit 3 of chapter 1, the age of revolution. And there will be 11 questions in this unit. And we will be covering the whole chapter through these 11 questions and their answers.
Now let's start with the first question. AD 1830 to 1848 is considered as the age of revolution. Explain. There are 2 points for this answer. As conservative regimes tried to consolidate their power since 1815. Liberalism and nationalism came to be increasingly associated with revolution in many regions of Europe, such as Italian and German states, in the Ottoman Empire, Ireland, and Poland. That is point number 1. These revolutions were led by educated middle class elite, among whom were professors, school teachers, clerks, and members of the commercial middle class. I will elaborate. Actually, this is a continuation of the previous chapter where we have studied in 1815 after the Battle of Waterloo, Treaty of Vienna. Treaty of Vienna in 1815 has reduced the powers of France. Many of the countries or territories annexed by Napoleon were again taken back, and the conservatives started wielding more power. Conservatives have come back to the power, and the King of Bourbon was reinstated, etc. We have studied. All right. And in this Treaty of Vienna, the 4 major European powers such as Prussia, Russia, Britain, Austria-Hungary, Austrian Empire, and these European powers actually they formulated the Treaty of Vienna, which eventually led to the conservatives coming back to the power. And as we have already discussed, these conservatives were intolerant to dissent. Dissent means difference of opinion. They were so intolerant and they were autocratic. These points we have already discussed in Unit 2. If you have not revised that Unit 2 part well, you can go back and check the class. Then you can come back and continue here. Okay, so now this is the political backdrop. This is the political scenario since 1815. And these conservatives were called neoconservatives. All right. So these neoconservatives, as the name implies, they were conservative in their mentality. They like monarchy. They like centralized power system. They never liked freedom, liberty, independence, etc. They were intolerant to dissent, etc., etc. And that resulted in people who like liberty and nationalism. Those were liberal and were having a nationalistic outlook. They started finding it difficult to live in this neoconservative environment. So what happened? Their aspiration started drifting towards revolutionary or radical ideas. Revolutionary or radical ideas. This period is now called the Age of Revolution. That led to this Age of Revolution from 1830 to 1848. So, this is the background or backdrop. Now, let's see this first point. As conservative regime tried to consolidate their power since 1815. What is the significance of 1815? Treaty of Vienna, restoration of power to monarchy. Okay. So, as conservative regimes tried to consolidate their power since 1815, liberalism and nationalism came to be increasingly associated with revolution. Now you have understood the reason why they started moving towards the revolutionary ideas. In many regions of Europe, and mostly this was found in Italy, German states, in the Ottoman Empire. Ottoman Empire was a huge empire which was extending from eastern side of Europe. So this can be taken as western side of Europe, and this could be the eastern part of Europe, Eastern Europe, and to some part of Africa in this side, and it extended to Middle East. Middle East means the Asian part. All right, like Turkey, Jordan, Iran, those portions. Okay, so many of these regions were coming under Ottoman Empire. Okay, so many provinces in Ottoman Empire were sympathetic about this revolutionary ideas, and so was in Italy at that point of time. It was not Italy, it was Kingdom of Two Sicilies and some small states. This later became Italy. So Italy, German states, Ottoman Empire, and Poland. This part. At that point of time, Poland wasn't a free country. Actually, it was coming under Russian Empire. Okay. So this Poland, Ireland, the next country, which is part of United Kingdom. So in Ireland, Poland, Ottoman Empire, Italy, and German states. In these parts of Europe, revolutionaries started getting sympathy. Revolutionary ideas started getting acceptance all over. Okay. Now, these revolutions were led by educated middle class elite. That was another important point. This is also something which we have discussed, because the emergence of middle class and the emergence of business class, we have discussed that in the previous chapter. So this educated middle class elite, among whom were professors, school teachers, clerks, and members of the commercial middle class. Who is a members of the commercial middle class means businessmen. All right, businessmen, traders, industrialists. All right, so examples for commercial middle class. And so we have got educated middle class elite, from whom this idea of revolution started spreading into different parts of Europe. So once again, the question is, AD 1830 to 1848 is considered as the age of revolution. Explain. So the backdrop is this. We have got conservative regimes which consolidated their power since 1815. Liberalism and nationalism came to be increasingly associated with revolution in many regions of Europe, such as the Italian and German states, in the Ottoman Empire, Ireland, and Poland. Second, these revolutions were led by educated middle class elite, among whom were professors, school teachers, clerks, and members of the commercial middle class. Okay, so 2 points. Now, moving on to the second question. Austrian Chancellor Clemens von Metternich remarked When France sneezes, the rest of the Europe catches cold. Explain. So when France sneezes, the rest of the Europe catches cold. Explain. And this was remarked by the Austrian Chancellor. That means any political changes that is happening in France will have tremendous impact all over the European nations or countries or territories at that point of time. So when there is any political change in France, it can influence other parts of Europe. That's what it means when France sneezes, the rest of the Europe catches cold. This implies the significance of France and the political environment in France. Hope it's clear to you now. Okay, point number one. AD 1830 to 1848 is referred to as the Age of Revolution in Europe. The first upheaval took place in France in July 1830. So it all started, this age of revolution, with an upheaval. Upheaval means people coming against the existing system through protest and march. Okay, so the first upheaval took place in France in July 1830. The Bourbon king, who had been restored to power in 1815 by conservatives, were now overthrown by liberal revolutionaries who installed a constitutional monarchy with Louis Philippe at its head. Okay, so the Bourbon king of France, who had been restored to power in 1850. In the previous session, we have discussed this extensively as a part of Treaty of Vienna. As a consequence of Treaty of Vienna, Bourbon king was restored as the king of France, and the conservatism, how neoconservatism have come back to existence. So the Bourbon king, who had been restored to power in 1815 by conservatives, were now overthrown by liberal revolutionaries who installed a constitutional monarchy with Louis Philippe at its head. You can see the portrait of Louis Philippe here. All right, we are familiar with this name Louis Philippe because it is associated with a garment brand, Louis Philippe shirts, etc. Okay, you would have seen this logo in many of our shirts. You can see this LP and this logo, and this is the portrait of King Louis Philippe. Okay, and this portrait whom you're seeing is the Austrian Chancellor Clemens von Metternich. Okay, now let's continue. Fourth point, the July Revolution, that is July 1830 upheaval in France, sparked an uprising in Brussels. Brussels is the capital of Belgium, present day Belgium, with its capital Brussels. Okay, and the July Revolution sparked an uprising in Brussels. You can see that this is Germany, bordering Germany, and this is the United Kingdom of Netherlands, and here is the France, and this is the Belgium. All right, and the Belgium with the capital Brussels. July Revolution sparked an uprising in Brussels, which led Belgium breaking away from the United Kingdom of Netherlands. Earlier, Belgium was a part of Netherlands and was called United Kingdom of Netherlands. Now, July Revolution sparked an uprising in Brussels, which led to Belgium breaking away from the United Kingdom of Netherlands. Thus, any political changes in France result in an overall political change in Europe. And that's the reason why Clemens von Metternich, Austrian Chancellor, remarked that when France sneezes, the rest of the Europe catches cold. In other words, any political change happening in France will have its impact all over Europe. Hope it's clear to you. Now we'll move on to the third question. Treaty of Constantinople of 1832 resulted in recognizing Greek Greece as an independent nation? Explain. So we have got three key words for this question: Treaty of Constantinople, recognition of Greece, independent nation. Okay. Now let's see the answer for this question. You should be writing 6 points. Point number one, since the 15th century, Greece was a part of Muslim Ottoman Empire. In the previous question, we have talked about the Ottoman Empire, which spread almost all over the Europe, starting from eastern part of Europe, extending up to Middle East Asia, and then it even stretched up to the northern part of Africa. Such a wide Ottoman Empire, and Greece was a part of this Muslim Ottoman Empire. As a result of growth of revolutionary nationalism in Europe, see the next keyword is revolutionary nationalism in Europe. In the second question, we did talk about revolutionary nationalism, and as a result of growth of revolutionary nationalism in Europe, struggle for independence started in Greece in 1821. Okay. Poets and artists lauded Greece as the cradle of European civilization. And what is a cradle? It is a small coat of babies, right? Okay, so small coat of babies, mostly with some kind of rocking mechanism. Okay, babies, when they are in this cradle, wherein you can always rock them while to make them sleep. Okay, so normally the word cradle implies that a place where everything begins. So beginning area, starting area, place of birth. That's what a figurative meaning of the word cradle of European civilization means. So poets and artists lauded Greece as the cradle of European civilization, meaning that the place where European civilization first sprouted, began. Okay, European civilization, and they mobilized public opinion. Who mobilized public opinion? These poets and artists. What do you mean by mobilizing public opinion? So they spread word and they started instilling this idea into more and more people, so that an opinion started coming out that Greece should become independent. All right. So poets and artists lauded Greece as the cradle of European civilization and mobilized public opinion for what? To support its struggle against Muslim empire. Why? Because the European nations were predominantly Christian. So Greece, which is the cradle of civilization, and that is under a Muslim empire, that should be liberated. That's a message they started planting on the minds of the people. Right? Who? The poets and artists. Greeks living in exile. See, Greeks living in exile. What do you mean by living in exile? People who are basically Greeks, they migrate to other countries, maybe fearing repression from the Ottoman Empire, fearing for life. They migrate to different parts of Europe, and they are called people, Greeks living in exile. What do? They live in other countries, yet they fund, they send money, they give support for the revolutionaries who are fighting for the independence or freedom of Greece. Okay, so Greeks living in exile supported the struggle for its independence. The English poet Lord Byron, you have a portrait of Lord Byron here. The English poet Lord Byron organized funds and later went to fight in the war. He himself got involved in the war against the Ottoman Empire for the independence of Greece. Finally, the Treaty of Constantinople. Constantinople is a place in this part of Greece. All right. So finally, the Treaty of Constantinople of 1832 recognized Greece as an independent nation. So for this question, we have got 6 points. I will summarize. Point number one, since the 15th century, Greece was a part of Muslim Ottoman Empire. as a result of growth of revolutionary nationalism in Europe, struggle for independence started in Greece in 1821. Poets and artists lauded Greece as the cradle of European civilization and mobilized public opinion to support its struggle against Muslim empire because predominantly European nations are Christian. Greeks living in exile supported the struggle for its independence. The English poet Lord Byron organized funds and later went to fight in the war. Finally, the Treaty of Constantinople of 1832 recognized Greece as an independent nation. Moving on to the fourth question. How culture contributed to nationalism in Europe? We have got 7 points. First one, culture, which includes art and poetry, stories, and music, help express and shape nationalist feelings. One of the major contribution came from a cultural movement in Europe in 1840s called Romanticism. So what is Romanticism? It's a cultural movement in Europe in 1840s. Okay. And what do they advocate? Romantic artists and poets emphasized on emotions, intuition, and mystical feelings to foster national sentiments rather than being objective, reasoning, and scientific. So, they propagated the idea of being nationalistic, ask people to get emotional about nation, go get sentimental. You should have what is called a national sentiments. Okay, and for that they always ask people to look at their culture, their collective identity, etc., rather than being very logical and being very reasoning and being very scientific. Because being objective, being very reasoning, and being scientific means that you'll keep doubting every step which you take. Instead, they believe that you should get overwhelmed with emotion about your nation. You should crave for your nation and you should always be emotional. Think emotionally instead of logically. These were the ideas which they have propagated. So, coming back to the third point, romantic artists and poets emphasized on emotions, intuition, whatever you feel like at the bottom of your gut. What do you think? Intuition. It need not be very logical. It should not or need not have very sound reasoning, but your feelings and thoughts. That is your intuition. And mystical feelings, like some kind of force is always be behind you. It is asking you to go forward, like Joan of Arc in France. She always believed that God has created her with a purpose of liberating France, etc. These kind of feelings you can call or term it as mystical feelings. All right. And this romantic artist and poets emphasized on people to become very emotional about their nation, have some kind of gut feelings, intuitions, and get this kind of mystical feelings about their purpose. For what? To foster national sentiments, like you should have some kind of a connect with the nation. You should crave for your nation building, and rather than being objective. Objective means you will start thinking very, very logically, like rational, right or wrong, needed or not needed, etc. What kind of benefit you get, what kind of loss you are going to make, etc. That is called being objective. Reasoning. So whether am I doing right, am I doing wrong, kind of reasoning, thinking, logical reasoning. Fine. Then is it scientific? Again, banking too much on science that, okay, this is not going to work, this will not work kind of analysis. Don't make these kind of things. This is what romantic artist recommended or advocated in that point of time. So this is all about romanticism. So this kind of idea spread in Europe in 1840s. Okay, their effort was to create. Now, why did they ask people to do this? Their effort was to create a sense of shared collective heritage. See, you people Say, for example, if you consider Germany as a homeland, then you all of us should have what is called a collective heritage. We all come from the same culture. A common cultural past is there. Okay, and there is a collective identity. You connect or identify yourself as a German or a French, like that, as the basis of nation. So the basis of very idea of nation building should be based on people having collective heritage, a common cultural past, a kind collective identity. So by going after this kind of emotions and intuitions and mystical feelings about your country or aspiration for nation, you will have what is called a collective heritage, collective cultural past, and collective identity, and that should be the basis of your nation building. Other romantics, such as German philosopher Johann Gottfried Herder, claimed that true German culture was to be discovered among common people, that is, das Volk in German, common man or das Volk. It was through folk songs, folk poetry, and folk dances. Look at this. It was through folk songs, folk poetry, folk dance. What is the significance of the term folk here? Because folk is nothing but used by common people, thus walk. So, thus walk always use this kind of folklore. They'll have folk songs, folk poetry, folk dances, folk stories, etc. And that the true spirit of the nation. And it was through folk songs, folk poetry, and folk dances that the true spirit of the nation. And in German, that is Volksgeist. So Volksgeist is the spirit of the nation that should be popularized through thus walk, common man, using folk songs, folk poetry, folk dances, etc. This is what Johann Gottfried Herder has emphasized. And so, collecting and recording these forms of folk culture was essential to the project of nation building. So, to summarize, what are the key points? Point number one, Romanticism. So, how culture contributed to nationalism in Europe? First of all, the contribution of Romanticism. Romanticism asked people to be emotional rather than being objective or reasoning. Then, through emotion, they should find out collective heritage, cultural past, collective identity. And one of the major propagandist for Romanticism was Johann Gottfried Herder, and he claimed that you should be able to bring in nation, German culture, and the German nation, that is national spirit, is through the common people, thus folk, and through their folk songs, folk poetry, folk dances, etc. All right. So by using these 7 points, you will be able to give a complete answer for this question. Now, moving on to the fifth question, dear students, the fifth question is the emphasis of vernacular language and the collection of local folklore could carry the modern nationalist message to large group of people. Explain the statement with Poland as a reference. Okay. So the emphasis of vernacular language and the collection of local folklore. So in the previous question, that is a fourth question, which you see here, we did discuss about romanticism and romantic artists of 1840s in Europe, how they asked to emphasize more on emotions rather than objectivity and reasoning, so that a national sentiments can be built up. In extension to that, we did talk about German philosopher Johann Gottfried Herder, who emphasized on folk songs, folk poetry, and folk dances, so that the true spirit of the nation, that is, Volksgeist, was to be popularized by thus walk, that is, common man. This is something which we have already discussed. Now, this question is an extension of the previous one, wherein They are asking to cite one of the European countries, Poland. How in Poland this idea of folklore and the emphasis on local language, vernacular language, in this case, Polish language, how this helped to spread the sentiments of nationalism among the local people, that is, thus woke, okay, to the large group of people, that is common men. How this idea of folklore and the local language could spread the idea or sentiments of nationalism among Polish people, that is in Poland. Okay, now let's see the most important points which should be discussed under this question, or which should be mentioned in the answer. Let's see those points. Okay, if such a question is being asked to cite Poland as a case study or example, the answer will carry the following points. 1. Poland was partitioned at the end of 18th century by Russia, Prussia, and Austria. First of all, Poland was partitioned at the end of 18th century by Russia, Prussia, and Austria. Even though Poland no longer existed as an independent territory in those days, that is in 1840s, Poland was no more an independent country. National feelings were kept alive through music and language. Second point. First point is Poland was already partitioned at the end of 18th century. That is, end of 18th century means between 1750s to 1799. Okay, so that is the second half of 18th century, right? So Poland was partitioned at the end of the 18th century by Russia, Prussia, and Austria. Even though Poland no longer existed as an independent territory in these times, national feelings were kept alive through music and language. Karol Kurpinski, a Polish musician and composer, whose portrait is what you're seeing here, for example, celebrated the national struggle through his operas and music, turning folk dances like Polonaise and Mazurka, something which you are seeing here. It's a typical Polish dance, okay, Polonaise and Mazurka, into nationalist symbols. Okay. Now, coming to the language part. After Russian occupation, the Polish language was forced out of schools and Russian language was imposed everywhere. Okay, so after Russian occupation, the Polish language was forced out of schools and the Russian language was imposed everywhere. So in our question, how language played a major role in evoking nationalism. Okay, in 1831, an armed rebellion against Russian rule took place, which was ultimately crushed by Russia. Following this, many members of the clergy in Poland, clergy means those who are serving in church, all right. Following this, many members of the clergy in Poland began to use language as a weapon of national resistance. Okay, how Polish was used for church gatherings and all religious instructions, even though many priests were imprisoned just because they used Polish language in church gatherings, and they were sent to Siberia. Siberia is near the Arctic Circle. It is towards the northern part of Russia. Okay, Siberia. Why Siberia? Because in those days, sending to Siberia is one of the most rigorous punishment that you can mete out to someone. So this part of Russia, which is close to Arctic Circle, has got an unforgiving climate. It's so harsh, inclement, unforgiving climate that ordinary person will not be able to survive in this part of the world. Okay, so it's so unforgiving climate, and therefore they were forced to send to Siberia for their refusal to preach in Russian. So Russia imposed this order that even church gatherings should be addressed in Russian and should not use Polish. Okay, so those priests who refused to obey Russian orders, they were sent to Siberia. Thus, the use of Polish language came to be seen as a symbol of the Polish nationalism and its struggle against Russian dominance. So you have got 7 points. Let's make a quick recap of these 7 points. What are they? Once again, so our question is how the emphasis of vernacular language, in this case Polish language in Poland, and the collection of local folklore could carry modern nationalistic message to large group of people. Explain the statement with Poland as a reference. So we are using this as Poland was partitioned at the end of 18th century by Russia and Austria. Even though Poland no longer existed as an independent territory, national feelings were kept alive through music and language. Karol Kurpinski, a Polish musician and a composer, for example, celebrated national struggle through his operas and music, turning folk dances like, don't ever forget this point, Polonaise and Mazurka, the two dance forms, folk dances, into nationalist symbols. So this musician spread the idea of nationalism through these dance forms. After Russian occupation, now coming to the language part. Okay, what was the biggest challenge faced by the Polish people vis-a-vis the language? After Russian occupation, the Polish language was forced out of schools and the Russian language was imposed everywhere. In 1831, an armed rebellion against Russian rule took place, which was ultimately crushed. So, a form of resistance was raised in 1831, though it failed, it got crushed by Russia. Following this, many members of the clergy in Poland. So, this rebellion and ultimately its failure, but invoked a feeling of nationalism among the clergy in Poland, that is, the church. They began to use language as a weapon of national resistance. That's the next point. And Polish was used for church gatherings and all religious instructions, even though many priests were imprisoned or sent to Siberia for their refusal to preach in Russian. So, Polish was used for church gatherings and all religious instructions, even though many priests were imprisoned or sent to Siberia for their refusal to preach Russian. So, the next keyword is sending to Siberia. Thus, the use of Polish language came to be seen as a symbol of the Polish nationalism and its struggle against Russian dominance. So, don't forget this. The key ideas are like point number 1, partitioning of Poland. All right. And point number 2, there was no such nation as a Poland in those days, yet Polish people have that sentiments of nationalism, which they kept alive through music and language. Third point is Polonaise and Mazurka. This is the catch terms I am giving you. Polonaise and Mazurka, Karol Kurpinski. Fourth point is armed rebellion, even though failed, but the outcome was it invoked some kind of nationalism among the church clergy. All right, and they decided to use language as the barrier weapon, and they used this weapon in church gatherings, and for that they faced imprisonment, or even somebody or some people were sent to Siberia. So Siberia is another peg word or catch word you can use. Finally, the conclusion is use of Polish language came to be seen as a symbol of Polish nationalism and its struggle against Russian dominance. So these are the 7 points that you should include, or through these 7 points you can cover the whole idea of vernacular language and local folklore with respect to Poland as an example. Hope it's clear to you. Dear students, moving on to the 6th question. The revolt led by weavers of Silesia in 1845 was just an extension of the economic hardships of Europe in the first half of 19th century. Explain. revolt led by weavers of Silesia in 1845 was just an extension of the economic hardships of Europe in the first half of 19th century. Explain. So first half of 19th century means 1800 to 1849 would be the first half, 1850 to 1899 would be the second half of 19th century. Okay, fine. So there was a revolt led by weavers, the working class in Silesia. Silesia is a small town in Poland. Okay, in Poland. This revolt by weavers was considered as a symbol of, an extension of the economic hardship that loomed all over Europe in the first half of 19th century. Some kind of portrait I have just given to you to get some image. All right. See, now, enormous increase in population all over Europe in the early 19th century resulted in heavy unemployment rate. The primary reason was a population explosion that took place in Europe in 1800s. Okay, and this increase in population resulted in migration of rural population people from the villages, rural population started migrating to cities for what? Expecting to get employment, to get job. And when these people came to the cities, they never had proper housing. Therefore, that resulted in increase in slum population. You can see this kind of portrait here. So that means very dilapidated, unsanitary conditions. Okay, they don't have a proper well-made house. Okay, so therefore there was an increase in slum population. Textile industry, which was the main source of employment in Europe, took a hit due to cheap import of textiles from industrialized nations like England. In the previous chapter, we have discussed about how industrialization first came to England and only later it spread to other parts of the Europe. So England was a predominant power in industrialized textile sector. So they could produce cheap textiles because it's all mechanized machines, and this cheap textiles they used to export from England, and other countries had to import these commodities, especially textiles, in their country. And that led to loss of employment for weavers because those countries were not industrialized. Therefore, the products, the textiles produced in those countries were expensive compared to England, or the goods coming from England, which was cheap. Why? Because it was already industrialized and mechanized. As a result, they could produce textiles en masse, or mass production was possible. Okay, because of mass production, the production cost was cheap in England. Okay, and therefore they could export this textiles, their commodity, to other countries, other parts of Europe. And when these textiles, cheap goods, started getting dumped in this part of Europe, what happened? Their craftsmen, the weavers, their product did not find any buyers, so they started losing job. So this is all about what happened when England started exporting cheap cotton to other countries. In other words, when other countries started importing cheap cotton or textiles from England, that led to massive unemployment in Europe. Okay, I hope you have understood this connection, like cheap import, how it affected other nations in Europe. Peasants suffered in the hands of aristocracy, which still wielded some power then, demanding feudal dues and obligation. To make things worse, the peasants who are at the receiving end, they again suffered. The reason? Aristocracy, even in 1850s, still wielded some power, and they kept on demanding feudal dues, money that should be paid to them by these poor peasants, and obligations. All right, the work which has to be done in their estate without any money. So they kept demanding. As a result, peasants suffered. The rise of food prices or bad harvest. This could lead to widespread pauperism in Europe. Pauperism means a condition of no money. Pauperism means lost everything, no money condition. So the rise of food prices or bad harvest could lead to widespread pauperism in Europe. So we have got the backdrop like this. First of all, population explosion, migration of rural population to cities, formation of slum or creation of slum population, loss of employment in textile industry due to cheap import of textiles from England. Also, aristocracy started exploiting peasants, making their life miserable, and rise of food prices or bad harvest, that means loss of crop, could lead to widespread pauperism in Europe. These were the reasons which were prevailing that led to, in this backdrop, that led to what? In 1845, cotton weavers in Silesia, a small town in Poland, led a revolt against contractors who exploited these weavers by underpaying them. Okay, so they were not paid what they ought to get. Okay, they reached to the mansions of these contractors. All right, there is a symbolic portrait. They reached to the mansions of these contractors and torched their houses. But the army suppressed this revolt, leading to the loss of lives of weavers. Okay, so this is all about revolt led by weavers of Silesia in 1845 was just an extension of the economic hardships of Europe in the first half of 19th century. Okay, so we have got 6 points. Moving on to the seventh question. What were the result of peasant uprising of 1848? Okay, widespread unemployment and food shortages brought the population of Paris out to the streets. In the sixth question, we did talk about what happened in 1840s in Europe due to population explosion, migration of rural population to cities, creating slums, and massive import of textiles from England, how it generated or created unemployment all over the rest of the Europe, etc. So, in continuation with that, widespread unemployment and food shortages brought the population of Paris out to streets. So in France, people started protesting. They came to the streets. Monarch Louis Philippe, who came to power in 1830 with the help of liberal nationalists, was forced to flee. We did discuss about this particular Louis Philippe, and when France sneezes, the rest of the Europe gets the cold. That question we discussed, the second question of this chapter, we did discuss about how Louis Philippe came to power with the help of liberal nationalists in 1830. The same Louis Philippe was forced to flee in 1848 as the monarch of France. He had to abdicate. Abdicate means resign and go. So he was forced to flee in this widespread revolt, peasant uprising of 1848. National Assembly proclaimed a republic. Republic means there will be a constitutional head elected by the people, being a sovereign nation, and if there is a elected head for the country or a nation, then it is called a republic. Okay, otherwise it is a monarchy. So up until now, France had a monarch who was Louis Philippe. Now he was forced to flee, and there will be a new elected head for the country. Then it becomes what is called a sovereign country with an elected head. will become a republic. For example, India is a republic with an elected president for us, whereas UK is a monarchy. UK is sovereign, but it is having a head, which will be either a king or queen. So is Australia. Australia is a monarchy. Even though Australia has got, even today, though Australia has an elected prime minister, the head is the king or queen of England. So is Canada. Canada is also a monarchy, but India is a republic. I hope you understood what exactly is a republic. Republic means we'll have an elected head. In India, the elected head is the president of India. Now, coming to the next point, suffrage. Suffrage means right to vote. Right to cast vote is called suffrage. And suffrage was granted to all males above the age of 21. Okay, up until now, that is in 1848, only few selected people were allowed to vote, like clergy, nobility, and some elite people were allowed to vote. Hereafter, every male above the age of 21 will have the right to vote, suffrage. Yet, females were not allowed. Females were not allowed to cast their vote. Okay. Next, right to work was guaranteed. Reason? Because the primary reason for this uprising was unemployment. Therefore, the immediate solution required was also employment. So, right to work was guaranteed. That is, some kind of employment was guaranteed. Now, national workshops to provide employment were set up. Okay, so we have got 6 points, and all these 6 points can easily be remembered and recalled. That's what I hope. Okay, now we'll have to move on to the next question. Next question, the eighth question. Parallel to the revolt led by peasants and workers in Europe in 1840s, a revolution led by educated middle class was underway. Explain the events that took place in the revolution of liberals in 1848. Okay, so in the seventh question, we did talk about peasants' revolt. Okay, and now we are getting into another revolt which is led by educated middle class. Let's see the highlight of that particular revolt. Once again, the question is parallel to the revolt led by peasants and workers in Europe in 1840s, a revolution led by educated middle class was underway. So please try to understand the key difference. Right now we are discussing about the revolution led by educated middle class. Explain the events that took place in the revolution of liberals in 1848. Okay, let's start. In France, revolution of liberals led to abdication of the monarch. Abdication means renunciation or giving up, vacate the position. That is called abdication. A republic based on universal male suffrage had been proclaimed. Universal means all male suffrage, right to vote, had been proclaimed. In Germany, in the seventh question, we did discuss about all males above the age of 21 get the right to vote, but not the females. Okay. Now, the third point is in Germany, Italy, Poland, and in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, where independent nation states did not yet exist. So, independent nation state. This concept we have been discussing throughout these first three chapters. And what is a nation state? Just to make a quick recap, nation state is a shared national identity based on common language, culture, history, or ethnicity. Hence, we can say that nation state refers to a sovereign state where the state and the nation are largely the same. Example, Japan, Iceland, China, where people share the same language, common language. All of them have got same ethnicity, no much diversity. Whereas India is a modern state. with people from different ethnicity, they speak different language, different culture. Yet in this diversity, we have unity. But in nation state, it is slightly different. This has been discussed in the previous questions. So coming back to the term, nation states did not yet exist. Men and women of general middle class demanded for the creation of a nation state on parliamentary principle, such as there should be a constitution, freedom of the press, and freedom of association. So, in Germany, Italy, Poland, and in the Austro Hungarian Empire, where independent nation states did not exist, they were all monarchies. Okay, men and women of liberal middle class, what did they do? They demanded for the creation of a nation state. So, educated middle class revolution, the primary demand or the most important demand was create a nation state based on what? Parliamentary principle, wherein you elect your representatives. And this parliamentary principles will have, there is something called a constitution that should be there, the freedom of press and freedom of association. So these should be the pillars with which a nation state had to be set up. This was the demand. In the German regions, a large number of political associations whose members were middle class professionals decided to vote for an all German National Assembly. Okay, all German National Assembly. In Germany, this was something which the middle class professionals have demanded. All right, then their 831 elected representatives convened at Church of St. Paul in Frankfurt on 18th May 1848. This is a portrait of this Church of St. Paul, and 831 members, elected members, getting represented at this particular All German National Assembly. Okay, so that in German regions, a large number of political associations whose members were middle class professionals decided to vote for an all German National Assembly. And their 831 elected representatives convened at Church of St. Paul in Frankfurt on 18th May 1848, drafted a constitution for a German nation to be headed by a monarchy subject to parliament. What do you mean by monarchy with subject to parliament? Normally, monarchy means it has got centralized power, mostly autocratic. Centralized power means all the power will be vested with the monarch. Okay, and it is therefore obviously autocratic. Now, this should not be the case. There can be a monarch heading the government, but the monarch should obey or oblige to the decision taken by the elected representatives, and they form the parliament. Okay. So, headed by a monarchy subject to a parliament. Now, the crown was offered. This monarchy, this crown of being a monarch was offered to Frederick William IV. There is a portrait of Frederick William IV, King of Prussia. This was offered by this 831 elected representatives in the German parliament, and the crown was offered to Frederick William IV, King of Prussia, even though he rejected the offer. So he was offered to become the monarch of German state. He was actually the King of Prussia, but then he refused or rejected the offer. So to sum up, we have got we are now discussing about the revolution led by educated middle class, and this educated middle class revolution has got the following outcomes. What are they? Okay, first of all, there will be 6 points. Okay, the first one, in France, revolution of liberals led to abdication of the monarch. Monarch was, he had to relinquish, he had to give up his power and just leave. Then a republic based on universal male suffrage had been proclaimed. So it's a republic, will be headed by an elected representative. But in Germany, Italy, Poland, and in Austro-Hungarian Empire, where independent nation states did not yet exist, what happened? Men and women of liberal middle class demanded for the creation of a nation state. At that point of time, France was already a nation. Okay. And this nation state on parliamentary principles such as a constitution, freedom of press, and freedom of association. That was a demand for the educated middle class. Then, in the German regions, a large number of political associations whose members were middle class professionals, decided to vote for an all German national assembly, something like a parliament. Their 831 elected representatives convened at Church of St. Paul in Frankfurt on 18th May 1848 and drafted a constitution for German nation to be headed by a monarchy but subject to parliament. Monarch cannot take his own decision. He has to obey what parliament recommends to him. The crown was offered to Frederick William IV, King of Prussia, even though he rejected the offer. Okay, so these are the 6 points that you should bear in your mind while answering this question. Okay, moving on to the next question, the 9th question. What were the reasons for the failure of the revolution of liberals in 1848? Reasons for the failure of the revolution of liberals in 1848. In the previous question, that is question number 7 and 8, we have discussed about the revolt of the peasants of 1845, then revolt of the educated middle class, that is liberals in 1848, how National Assembly of Germany was formed at St. Paul's Church in 1848 at Frankfurt, etc., etc. So in continuation of those 2 questions, let's see this question. What were the reasons for the failure of the revolution of liberals in 1848? Liberals offered the crown of the monarchy to Frederick William IV, the King of Prussia. This is something which we have discussed in question number 8. And he rejected the offer and joined other monarchs to oppose the elected assembly. Okay, that is the German National Assembly. The parliament was dominated by the middle classes who resisted the demands of workers. We should connect these dots, like in 1845, it was the peasant uprising against the unemployment, etc. But then when these middle classes, when they came to the power, they just ignored the demand by the so-called workers and artisans. Who are artisans? Artisans are highly skilled workers. Skilled workers are called artisans. For example, look at this. Artisan work. These are all highly skilled works which you see in these images. Now you can understand what is this artisanry all about. Okay.
Revolutionaries consequently lost artisans' support.
So even though revolution of middle classes led to coming to power, forming parliament, the problem was that they could not sustain, they couldn't move forward just because they lost their support from
Workers and artisans who form
what are called masses. So the mass base of the movement was lost. Middle classes resisted the demand, or they couldn't address the problem of the workers and artisans. As a result, they lost their support. That means mass base got eroded. Okay. Thus, the social basis of the parliament eroded. But the opposition of the aristocracy and military became stronger. Look at this. This monarchy, clergy, nobility, they form what are called aristocracy. Aristocracy means the powerful lot, elite, noble class, and military. Military always want to exercise their dominance and power. Military is more of an autocratic entity, and both of them were against the so-called parliamentary form led by middle classes. When this social base got eroded because they lost support from workers and artisans, what happened? The opposition led by aristocracy and military became stronger. In the end, troops, that is military, forced the liberals to disband. Disband means break down or dissolve. Disband the assembly. Here assembly implies the national assembly, okay, or in other words a parliament. So what were the reasons for the failure of revolution of liberals in 1848? Yeah, the simple straight answer is they lost the mass base, or social basis was lost just because middle classes were not very sensitive to the demands of workers and artisans. Is it clear? Okay. Moving on to the 10th question of chapter 3. Even the so-called liberals and their revolution of 1848 could not address the issue of political rights of women. Discuss. Okay. So political rights of women was not addressed even by the so-called liberals. So liberals are people who have got a liberal view on social life, political life. They are based on, their thought process is based on liberty and democracy. So even these liberals could not address the issue of women, especially their political rights. Discuss. Point number one. So we have got 4 points here. Point number one, large numbers of women actively participated in political movement against autocracy, that is monarchy, over the years in Europe, all over the Europe. Women had formed their own political associations, founded newspapers, and taken part in political meetings and demonstrations. So they did all kind of social and political activities. They were very active in those movements. Okay. Despite this, they were denied suffrage. As I told you, it is the right to vote. We have discussed this about this adult suffrage in question number 8 as well as in 9. So right to vote, that's called suffrage. Despite this, they were denied suffrage rights, that means right to vote, during the election of the assembly. Okay, in National Assembly of 1848 at St. Paul's Church in Frankfurt, you should see that women are just the spectators. And here are those 831 members who are taking decisions. They are forming the parliament, and all the women should be sitting in the gallery as mere spectators. Even when the liberals convened in the Church of St. Paul, women were admitted only as observers to stand in the visitors' gallery. All right. So they were just visitors. Okay. And they were not allowed to participate. So even the so-called liberals and their revolution of 1848 could not address the issue of political rights of women. So you'll have to answer 4 points. Hope it's clear to you. Coming to the last question of Unit 3, Chapter 1, the 11th question. What were the outcomes or results of liberal movements of 1848 in the political scenario of Europe? Though conservative forces were able to suppress liberal movements in 1848, they could not restore the old order. That is point number one. Monarchism realized the need to grant concessions to the liberal nationalist revolutionaries. Third point, thus serfdom and bonded labor were abolished both in the Habsburg dominions and in Russia. The Habsburg rulers granted more autonomy to the Hungarians in 1867. So these are the 4 major outcomes of liberal movements of 1848. Now let's discuss each one of this. Okay, let's see what it is. Though conservative forces were able to suppress liberal movements in 1848, they could not restore the old order. What was that old order? Here, the term old order implies monarchy which has got centralized power, then intolerance towards dissent. Anybody who disagree with you will be immediately punished. No voice of dissent was allowed, and freedom of press was curtailed. Journals, newspapers, nothing were allowed to write anything against the ruling class. Okay, so freedom of press was curtailed. Overall, the idea of liberty was not accepted in those days. That is called the old order. But after 1848, this forces, that is, the conservatives or the conservative forces, realized that they can't go back to the old order because the Europe has changed a lot under liberal movements. Monarchism realized the need to grant concessions to the liberal nationalist revolutionaries. What do you mean by granting concession? Like being saying that okay, now that you can publish whatever you want against anyone, you'll have the freedom to dissent, you have the freedom to associate, etc. These were considered not as rights but as concessions given by the monarchy. Okay, and third point, thus serfdom and bonded labor were abolished both in the Habsburg dominions and Russia. What does that mean? Serfdom and bonded labor. Already we have discussed this under Unit 2, where the social system in Europe in 19th century, we have discussed that if this is the social hierarchy, if you take this triangle as a social hierarchy or a pyramid of hierarchy, on the top you have got the king or monarch, then comes nobility, clergy, etc. And finally, at the bottom of the pyramid, you get who are called as peasants or serfs. They are at the receiving end. They are being mistreated by everyone in the hierarchy, like nobles and knights and clergy,
The peasants got mistreated.
and they were exploited. And one of the most important instrument of exploitation was the serfdom, kind of labor which you have to do, and it was bonded labor. That means you can't move out of your estate. You can't dissociate from the estate owner. You are obliged to work in that field, which we have already discussed in the previous question. Okay, you can refer that video. So serfdom and bonded labor were abolished. Okay, and both in the Habsburg dominion and Russia. What is Habsburg dominion? Habsburg is an empire, actually, a huge, vast empire which includes present day Austria, Hungary, Slovakia, etc. You can look at the map and understand how far and wide it was. Okay, this Habsburg Empire somewhere came to power somewhere in 1200 and lasted till 1918, immediately after the World War I. It lasted, and this was a vast empire which was having lots of vassal states or states. You call them dominions. That means they were under the Habsburg Emperor. Okay, so they are part of Habsburg Empire, these dominions. That's what they are mentioning here. For that, the serfdom and bonded labor were abolished both in the Habsburg dominions. That means places coming under Habsburg Empire and in Russia. Okay, so both Habsburg Empire and Russian Empire were the huge or predominant powerful empires in Europe. Okay, so in both these places, serfdom and bonded labor were abolished. That was a major outcome of liberal movement of 1848. Finally, the Habsburg rulers granted more autonomy to the Hungarians, which was under Habsburg Empire in 1867. That was also an outcome of liberal movement of 1848. Okay, hope it's clear to you. And with this chapter, this unit 3 of chapter 1 is over. All right. Now we will have to move on to the next unit, unit 4.
If you find this class useful, please let me know by pressing the like or hike button and by writing your comments. If you want more such videos, please subscribe to my channel, follow my page and share my videos. And I wish you all the best for your exams.